As you've heard, I'm a farmer. I've been farming in North Wiltshire for the last 30 years on a tenanted farm there. I'm going to talk a little bit about my farming experience of going organic and what we've learned, what we do differently. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work that the Soil Association is doing to help improve organic and non-organic systems that are using organic techniques. I started life as with all the normal aspirations of a teenager growing up on a farm in the 1970s. Then it was all about, can we get 10,000 litres out of a cow each year? Can we grow that 10 tonne a hectare crop of wheat? It was all about that production agenda. It was macho to grow big crops, it still is actually. As I started to learn a little bit more about where our farming was going awry, as I started to see the wildlife disappearing on the farm that I'd grown up on, and for the first time actually went into intensive pig and poultry systems and saw the real distress actually and the intense boredom that those animals that we use for food live in. I started to think maybe there's another way. My first foray into organic farming was actually when I was still doing my degree in agriculture. I was very interested in soils. I was very interested particularly in the phosphate release from soils, and that was my sort of little project that I was doing. So I converted one of the fields on the farm in 1984 to do some work on phosphate release from a number of materials and looking at that whole system in more depth. So when I took on the farm in 1986, I already had a 20-acre site that I'd started to do some trials work on. And I was only 24 when I took on the farm, and you can imagine in the area, not only were the farm staff looking askance, but all the neighbouring farmers were thinking, ooh, what's happening here? There aren't many females going into farming in those days, and certainly the rumour had started to spread that I was slightly interested in some alternative approaches. And so somewhat to build the confidence of the farm, and also to make sure that we weren't going to make some huge mistakes, because I was, as I say, a tenant, I had a rent to pay, I had to make a commercial success of my farming. I decided to play around and do some trials on this 20 acres for the first year or two. And we put in place our first crops of legumes, of clovers. We started to play around with intercropping, so growing two crops at the same time. We had our first house of laying hens. We had planted an orchard, growing vegetables in raised beds, trying all sorts of things, as well as carrying on with some of this soils work. And by the time I'd been doing this for a year or two, I was convinced that organic farming was right for me, and we started to convert the whole farm as it came into the lay phase of the rotation. So we converted the whole farm over about 8 years. And I suppose the other thing that I really felt when I came back to the farm was just how much everybody was trying to sell me something. So, there were reps rolling up the drive every half an hour, promising me that this input was going to increase my yield by X, or this whatever was going to, improve my disease resistance by Y. And one of the things I wanted to do was to test what it was possible to produce just using the resources that we had on our own farm. That in itself has been very salutary. So there were a lot of reasons why I went down that route. I could tell you all the adventures that I've had, and I'll tell you one or two of them that are relevant to you today. Not all the ones around marketing, which are extremely another story altogether. But what did we do then when we started to convert? Well, the first thing that we had to do was to establish a decent rotation. And I guess for a lot of people, organic farming is, people think of organic farming as being the things you don't do. You don't use all these inputs. Okay, that's true, but it's much more about what you do. And I have a feeling I'm preaching to the converted here, you'll know a lot about all this stuff already. But establishing a good rotation is absolutely key to an organic farming system where you're going to be growing crops for human consumption. You do have some all grass systems or even all tree systems, but usually it's about a rotation. And a lot of the things that we perhaps have got very dependent on as farmers, using a lot of nitrogen fertilizer, that's all replaced with clovers, with leguminous crops that fix the nitrogen naturally and leave it in the ground for subsequent crops. So that rotation is always based around growing leguminous crops for a period of time, building the soil fertility, particularly the soil nitrogen, building the organic matter in the soil, and then cashing some of that in when you're growing your wheats or your barleys or your oats. The other thing we had to start to do was to manage our manures properly. And I still find it extraordinary that loads of people talk about manure as waste. We're constantly talking about waste on farms. For an organic farmer, that waste is gold dust. And we want to look after it as best we can. Because it's through those manures that you're recycling, particularly your phosphate and potassium, and making sure that you're using that efficiently and well. So when I took on the farm, and when I talk to farmers today, I always assume this stuff is normal practice now, but I'm told it's still not. When I took on the farm, the fields closest to the dairy herd were very high, over high in P&K, an index of 5s or just off the scale, because all the muck that was coming out of the sheds each year was being put on those fields closest to the dairy because it was just more convenient than actually bothering to take it up the hill. And we were buying in masses of expensive fertilizers to put on the outlying fields where the indices were much lower. So just doing simple things like managing your manures properly, testing soils on a regular basis so that you know which fields need those manures the most. Just some of those basic adjustments were some of the core things that we started to do. On the animal side, I think my farm staff, particularly my dairy guys, were terrified about the idea of moving away from the use of routine antibiotics. All our cows, like virtually every cow at that time, and actually most cows still today, received a prophylactic antibiotic at drying off when they have a rest before they calve again to prevent mastitis. Obviously we can't do that in an organic system. We can use antibiotics, but we can't use them on a regular basis just to prevent disease. We have to get the system right so that antibiotics are only used when they're really necessary, just as we should be doing in human medicine. Get your husbandry right, and you don't usually need to use these kind of products which may have negative outcomes. And I suppose that's the core of an organic farming system. It's making the most of your own resource, establishing a good rotation, putting soils first, feeding your soils, not the plant directly, one of the organic mantras, building organic matter, because that gives you resilience to droughts and floods and holds the nutrients in the soils. Makes it much easier and cheaper to work the soils because you're not having to put a lot of fuel through your tractors to plough them or to cultivate them. Getting those basics right, to me, is what organic farming is all about. So I get sometimes a bit mystified why it's put in this kind of box marked rather controversial and cranky. To me, organic farming is just common sense. It's the way we should all be farming. We might then decide to use one or two inputs in certain circumstances. I'm not suggesting everybody is going to be certified organic and producing organic food. But those basic techniques, and we can explore some of these a bit more in detail, are just fundamental to all farming and land use systems. So all of this, I suppose, took me into my life with the Soil Association. I'm going to come back to the farming again in a moment. This, I don't know how many of you know the Soil Association, perhaps some of you are even members. The Soil Association is a membership charity which has been established since 1946, so 70 years old today, this year. And it was really formed to actually understand that link between the health of our soil, the health of our plants, the health of animals and ourselves. It's basically, if we get soils right, most other things fall into line. And I'm just looking at some of the posters at the back while I was having a cup of coffee, and I can see that the work you're doing here is all in this vein. So again, I feel I'm probably preaching to the converted. The work we do today is very much based around three main areas, I suppose. One is around sustainable, healthy diets, because if we're going to meet the challenges that are facing us that you all know about so well, we are going to need to eat, consume less, waste less. We're going to need to eat less meat, but that meat needs to be produced well, both from things like antibiotic resistance, but also not competing with humans for cereals and other crops. So sustainable healthy diets, we do a lot of work in schools, we do a lot of work with caterers, trying to help a good diet, a good sustainable diet become the norm. The second thing we do is to help farming, develop farming systems that look after the environment inherently, trying to, rather than the sort of separation out, it's just kind of, you know, thrash the land to death in one place and then we'll have a little, the wildlife reserve over here. Our fundamental philosophy is that all farming needs to look after nature, look after the ecosystem services that the land provides, look after animal welfare. And so developing obviously organic farming systems, but also sharing those approaches with non-organic farmers too, because it's not enough just to have a nice little pocket of farms that are doing great stuff marked organic. We're going to need to shift the whole of our farming systems in a more sustainable direction. Again, that's what you're up to here. And the third thing we do, we run a business arm which certifies, which audits organic farms, also caterers, so non-organic but moving in the right direction, food service, and forests. So we're involved in certifying forests, very interested by the last presentation from that point of view. We work in 44 countries around the world, auditing forests to Forest Stewardship Council standards. So using schemes and the marketplace as one lever for driving change in the world. Now, as of course, not everybody's going to go organic, as I've just said. I think the market is growing. There are some opportunities. But what I really want to talk about today is the big challenges that are facing farmers on the ground and how organic techniques can really help us overcome some of those challenges. And it's remarkable. Even 5 years ago, you really didn't have much discourse around soils anywhere. And in the last couple of years, I'm so thrilled to see soils coming into the mainstream far more. If you read the farming press every week now, there's some story about soils and how we can improve them. So farmers who, when I was talking to farmers 10 or 20 years ago, they would just say, when I talked about soil health, they would just say, we've been farming this way for 30 years, everything's fine, yields are still going up. All of that has changed. Yields are not going up anymore, and in my view, a large reason for that is running into the buffers on soils, particularly in the east of England, where they have just kind of got rid of every animal and have been running the most ridiculously straightforward rotations, basically wheat and oilseed rape, for the last 30 years. And those soils in the east of England are often down to 1% organic matter, so incredibly low levels. And farmers are now finding it difficult to establish crops. They're certainly finding it difficult to deal with some of the challenges like blackgrass that have also built up around those systems. So we do a lot of work on trying to promote techniques to improve soils. Again, really basic stuff, getting some grass back into the rotation, using cover crops, not leaving land bare over the winter, getting rid of maize, which is probably the biggest soil destroyer on the planet. The levels of erosion from late harvested maize are absolutely disgraceful, and the use of maize for biomass, for anaerobic digestion, should be stopped altogether. So there's some real challenges around that. Starting to get farmers interested in trees on farms more, and there's one very interesting guy some of you may have come across in the fens. And if you all know the fens, how much soil, 4 meters of soil being lost over the last 100 years or so. Still very, very important to be maintaining that organic matter in those high peat soils. Looking after our peat is probably one of the most important things we can do from a climate change point of view, let alone an agronomic point of view. Again, I saw a poster on that at the back. Trying to stop the wind blow on those exposed fenland soils, one of the best ways of doing that is putting trees in place. And this guy has started using apple trees, actually, so he's got another crop on the fens. It's been very controversial. How can such a thing be controversial? Because some people like to have hundreds of miles of completely barren wilderness to look at, I don't know why, rather than a few nice trees. So some of those techniques, I think, are going to be increasingly important. So soils it is a happening thing. And increasingly, we're encouraging, and more farmers are getting interested in putting livestock back onto those soils in the east of England. And our premise is that actually all these pigs and chickens that are being locked up in sheds all over the country should be released into the east of England to provide fertility for those soils which would need it so much. The grains being produced there that they would eat, and you've got the straw there that they need for bedding. It makes absolutely sense to be locating as much as possible your pigs and poultry in more free-range circumstances on those soils of East England. But sheep, dairy, anything, get some animals back on that land. I've mentioned blackgrass already, and weeds like blackgrass, the chemistry is running out on these for these tenacious weeds, and blackgrass populations have always been high, because if you're growing winter cereal after winter cereal, and a move to autumn sowing on a continuous basis means that those weeds in a high fertility situation just have a chance to get going and get very difficult to control. And inevitably, if you're using the same chemistry on these year after year after year, they start to develop resistance, and that's what's happening. So a lot of farmers are starting to rethink their farming systems just on the back of the fact that they can't control their blackgrass. And again, an organic farming system, weeds like blackgrass are really never a problem, because you're looking at that mixture of crops. So we don't always use autumn sown crops, we're using spring sown crops. You've got a grass layer in the rotation, which gives good control of blackgrass. So again, getting into a good rotation, not doing the same thing year after year on the same field, which is basic, the basic storyline for everything, almost everything, is key. I've mentioned antibiotics. And the Soil Association has been campaigning around the overuse of antibiotics in animal husbandry systems for over 20 years now, because there was evidence, even 20 years ago, that antibiotics overuse was leading to resistance in the human population. It's taken 20 years to get that case accepted, and it is now accepted, which is great news in many ways, because if you don't start looking for the resistance in the human population and understanding where that's coming from, then that problem can just get worse and worse and worse. So antibiotic use, everybody now accepts very suddenly over the last year or two that we need to massively reduce the use of antibiotics in livestock. We need to move away from using the third and fourth generation cephalosporins and some of the more modern drugs that are very important, critically important in human medicine. And so there's an interest, finally, in how do you develop systems that aren't dependent on antibiotic use. And again, that's something that organic farming has to offer in spades, because, as I said earlier, when we can use them, we use them very, very sparingly. And that, again, is about going back to good husbandry. The reason we don't need antibiotics is that you're giving your animals plenty of space, a low-stress life, weaning later in the case of things like pigs and calves, bedding, plenty of bedding, a more natural diet, not trying to over-push on the production side. And so, on my own farm, in our pig systems, we would probably use about 1/1000 of the antibiotic that are used in a typical high-intensive indoor pig system. And in our dairy herd, at least probably around 10% of the antibiotic use that you use in a reasonably good modern dairy systems. So huge amount to offer in terms of understanding how to reduce the use of antibiotics in these systems. Again, I don't know how much of you are you livestock people at all. Is it all mostly crops? I won't bang on about animals, even though they're my favourite subject. I was going to talk about worm resistance and humidity resistance, but you don't need to know about that. I guess one of the other areas, one of the other big challenges we face is the nitrogen oversupply into the environment. So getting through, that our sort of our biological limits on that, I think is a very unrecognised problem. Nitrogen fixation is also a very energy expensive process, and one of the reasons why our energy balance or our greenhouse gas contribution from agriculture is so great is because of the artificial fixation of nitrogen. So you've got a problem in making it, you've got a problem in using it. And again, the move towards the use of legumes, whilst it's obviously still fixing nitrogen, you're scavenging the system much harder with an organic system for that nitrogen. And I think there's, that has a huge amount to offer in terms of not constantly pumping more nitrogen into our system. And maybe lastly on this, phosphate. There was a while ago we were talking about peak phosphate. I think they keep discovering more reserves of it, but it won't last forever. And again, environmentally, it can have strongly negative impacts if you're pumping too much of it into the system. So again, recycling our phosphates, looking after them well. I think there's still a big conversation to be had around sewage sludge and making sure that recycles back onto land. And we're still not, we're not putting all of this treated stuff into the sea. Still, the opportunity to scavenge in treatment plants for phosphate too, and to crystallise that out, are all going to be important. But maintaining and protecting our phosphate is going to be key. And again, that whole idea of recycling within an organic system is key to that. So there's lots more I could talk about in terms of what organic farming has to offer, some of the challenges we face today, but I hope I've made the case that those kind of sensible, common sense husbandry techniques based around good soil management are going to be vital. That's not to say that there aren't still challenges. There are plenty of challenges within organic systems still. The two big ones for me are still wheat yields. When people say, oh, organic is so unproductive, how are you ever going to feed the world? It only produces half the food. They're talking about wheat. If you look at most other crops, the yield gap is much, much less. But wheat we do have a problem with, because for the last 40 years, everybody's been breeding wheats to respond to very high nitrogen situations. And they've been growing wheats which are about that high, and rather than their more natural height, shortening the straw to get better partition into the seed, and therefore they are very bad at smothering weeds. And that's the other problem still in an organic system. Some of the more easily controllable weeds, using sort of broad spectrum cheap herbicides, not your blackgrasses and things which are more systemic, but some of your weeds like charlocks and stuff like that are more prevalent in organic farming systems. So we do need some help, definitely in terms of things like appropriate wheat breeding for organic systems. And it's interesting, we started growing spelt on the farm, so quite an old-fashioned type of cereal, and have, even though we expected to see a yield decrease below what we get for modern wheats in an organic system, we found quite the opposite. Some of these older varieties, some of these older genotypes are much more suited, and we're getting exceptionally good yields of spelt. It's tall, it smothers the weeds, it gives great yields in moderate fertility situations. So there's lots to do around wheat yields. There's lots to do around weeds, and I'm quite excited actually by this new era of robotics that's coming through. I think that some of the engineering solutions will help us, whether we're organic or not, actually become much, much more precise with the way we're using our inputs. and the opportunity to do things like laser weed in horticultural systems, because labour cost is still one of the big problems in an organic horticultural system in terms of inflating the cost of production. So there are still some challenges there. And there are some really big opportunities too. I've mentioned trees. And my latest, I've been interested in trees and agroforestry for a long time. And agroforestry is of course not new. There are loads of it going on all over the world, in China, a lot more in Europe, India. But actually here, agroforestry, the use of productive trees alongside an agricultural system, rather than here you've got a forest and here you've got farmland, is still quite novel. And our policy mechanisms currently mitigate against it, because you don't get your support payments if you start planting trees at more than a certain density. So one of the things I'm doing on my own farm, alongside my existing dairy and beef and sheep and pigs and arable crops, is experimenting with agroforestry and starting both on an experimental and on a more commercial basis to play around with productive trees like nuts. There's, I think, a huge opportunity to be increasing the volume of nuts we're producing in this country, obviously fruits, trees for biomass, trees for livestock grazing, things like willow for livestock grazing. So that, I think, holds huge potential. And we're also looking at new crops, as particularly as we start to see climate changing. We're able to look at new crops like keynote. I think we'll be growing soy here in the next decade or so. There's some experimenting going on already. Things like lupins. I'm going to be planting almonds and apricots within this agroforestry setup. So there's the opportunity for new, more diversified crops as well. So challenges and opportunities. And so I just want to end by talking for a couple of minutes about some of the work that the Soil Association is doing to try and help farmers innovate and experiment more and better. Right at the outset, I talked a bit about my own 20-acre trial plot that I ran for a short period of time. And I was really interested in research. I think a lot of farmers are actually. Farmers are always testing stuff. A lot of the best ideas actually come directly from the farm. And yet, there's no support mechanism for farmers who want to do their experimenting. That I found that it was a pretty lonely business trying to do that out on your own. Nobody's particularly interested, none of the research institutes are particularly interested, and so after a while you kind of give up. And yet I think that if, given that we need to be testing a lot of ideas quite rapidly now, and given that there's very little public funding going into applied research on farms, it becomes increasingly important to give farmers the opportunity to test ideas that allow them to use their resources more efficiently and better, and to stand on their own 2 feet rather more. So we're very keen to put farmers much more in the driving seat on testing and trialling. And I use the word research with caveats, because what we're doing is kind of pitching it somewhere between the sort of anecdotal, I tested a bit of this and it kind of looked like that, against at the other end, a fully replicated, really well-established trial that you would do in a research facility. We're trying to fill that middle ground. So where we have groups of farmers who want to tackle a challenge together, we match them up with a researcher to support them, to actually help them with trial design, and we can give small research grants to enable that testing to be done on a semi-professional basis. One of the first benefits of that is that you get great knowledge exchange, both between the farmers who are interested in a certain challenge, but also in terms of establishing where the science is at in that area. And knowledge exchange, everybody always goes on about this, there's, without our extension services to farmers, farmers struggle to pick up the latest work. So this is one way of quickly, while they've got an appetite for learning about something, making sure they know where the science is at, and then where their mutual experience can actually help them improve their systems quite rapidly. And it also means, because a lot of research that's done, and I wasn't thinking of that as the pipeline of research as it comes down to farmers. A lot of it's done in can be done in very specific circumstances, and actually it's going to be increasingly important to establish what works in that particular area, on those particular soils. And it can also really generate ideas which can be then picked up by research institutes and run with. So one of the things, one of the projects that one group of farmers ran with a year or two ago was looking at insects, feeding insects to poultry. There were all sorts of problems with this in terms of getting the permission to do the trials, but once it actually happened, that's now got a £500,000 grant has been taken into further research. So our Innovative Farmers Network, which is part of the Dutch Future Farming Programme, is very much about trying to help farmers do their own work, and I think, and linking that up with all the research institutes that are keen to get involved with that. So if anybody's interested in any of those trials, there's about 35 groups going on at the moment on all sorts of topics, from compost teas as a replacement for fungicides to the use of diverse herbal leis, all sorts of stuff. And it's been a really riveting process, and I've been involved with it as a farmer and obviously also in my role as Chief Executive of the Soil Association. So that's just a bit of a scoot through some stuff. I hope I've made the case that good organic farming should be the norm, should be the sort of core in our farming systems, that these techniques are absolutely the basis of good husbandry.